For the last part of Chapter 13, we're going to talk about aggression. Aggression is behavior that is intended to harm another. And during this video, we're going to talk about biological factors, environmental factors, and psychological factors that are all going to influence aggression. So the biological factors, again, might be kind of familiar with stuff that you would have covered back in 104. So we can talk about the heredity of aggression, where when we look at aggression levels between different types of relatives, we see that the more genetically related they are, the more similar their levels of aggression are. So if we looked at identical twins that share 100% of their genetic material, if one twin is aggressive, the other twin is very likely to also be aggressive. If we look at fraternal twins that only share 50% of their genes, then you're going to see a less close relationship where one twin being aggressive is less predictive of the aggressiveness level of the other twin. So it's still going to be correlated, but it's a lot more strongly correlated when they share more genetic material. So that tells us that there is some kind of genetic basis to at least some forms of aggression. And we have some more evidence for this if we look at things like stickleback fish. These guys would have been talked about as sort of exemplars of what's called a fixed action pattern, where a certain stimulus, called a releaser stimulus, triggers a very predictable and ordered or structured response to that particular stimulus. So for these stickleback fish, their stimulus is the red belly of another male stickleback. So when a stickleback, specifically when a male stickleback fish, sees another male with a red belly, they're going to attack it. They're going to show aggression as a fixed action pattern, as this completely biological, as a completely genetic response to that particular stimulus. This isn't something that's necessarily learned, it just happens automatically. So it's an inherent trait that these fish possess. And so the three images on the screen here are three different stimuli that would have been shown to a male stickleback fish. So they could be shown a realistic fish, but this realistic fish doesn't have a red belly, so it doesn't elicit that aggressive response. However, these weird sort of fish-shaped images down here have that red belly, that red bottom, and they will trigger an aggressive attack. So this is enough to count as another male for that fish's response, and they will aggressively attack this. And even this one, which is not very fish-shaped at all, is still enough to trigger an aggressive response. So that tells us that there are certain aggressive responses, at least in stickleback fish, that are driven by genetic factors. So there is some kind of innate biological drive for aggression in some cases. Continuing on with this biological interpretation, we can start pointing to different parts of the brain that seem to be related to aggression. Things like our hypothalamus, our amygdala, and other parts of our cortex seem to be active or inactive in particular patterns when we're displaying aggressive behavior. In experiments that involve stimulating the hypothalamus, we can actually trigger aggressive behaviors. So the hypothalamus seems to be at least involved in triggering aggression. Destruction of the amygdala seems to decrease aggression. So by removing this particular structure in the brain, you can reduce aggression. And this has been done in humans and other non-human animals. So the way that they managed to do this in humans was that the procedure was done on aggressive inmates as an attempt to try and reduce their aggressive behaviors. And it happened to work. In other species, it's a little bit easier to go in and do lesion studies and say damage the amygdala to see how behavior changes. I just thought I'd point out how they managed to get that to work in humans with the ethical gray area that might exist in. But this is a really good point to a really good place to point out that no one single structure is a magical on-off switch for all types of aggression. Things like the hypothalamus, if you stimulate it, you can get aggressive posturing. Destroying the amygdala can lead to a decrease in defensive aggression, in aggression that responds to, or that happens in response to something. But there are lots of different kinds of aggression, and they seem to maybe have different neural circuits involved. So, defending yourself, defending your offspring, being a predator and being aggressive in a predatory fashion, or establishing dominance, or any of the other endless list of ways to be aggressive, they don't all seem to use the same neural circuitry. So there isn't this one magical structure that is the home of all aggression. It's a little bit more diffused than that. And if we want to keep talking about other areas that are involved in aggression, we can talk about our frontal lobes. Our frontal lobes play a really strong role in our ability to control impulses. So what we actually see is that people who have committed murder, who have committed impulsive, aggressive crimes, tend to show lower activity in their frontal lobes. So less activation in that area is leading them to have more impulsive behavior and less impulse control. And in the same vein as there is no one particular structure that's related to aggression, there's also no one hormone or one neurotransmitter or no chemical that is specifically wired for aggression. There are some relationships where lower serotonin levels than normal can lead to aggressive behavior, and there are some cases where higher levels of testosterone can be associated with things like social aggression. But again, there isn't one particular chemical that is related to all types of aggression. It's a lot more broad than just that. Now, moving on from those biological factors that can influence aggression, we're going to start talking about things in the environment that can influence aggression. Now, this can be our current physical environment, the things that are actively surrounding us, and this can also include previous learned experiences, things that we've learned from interacting with our environment in the past. All of this falls under the same umbrella. But the textbook starts by explaining one particular hypothesis, and this is the frustration-aggression hypothesis. Now, this hypothesis suggests that frustration leads to aggression, and aggression is the result of frustration. So this was an early hypothesis trying to explain where aggression came from, and it was basically saying that you had to have been frustrated to then be aggressive. So there's this loop of you're frustrated to the point of lashing out and being angry. But there really wasn't a whole lot of evidence for this. So this theory is no longer accepted, but it did get us started on this sort of evaluation of where aggression might be coming from. So the parts that we can see as sort of being valid is there's quite a bit of evidence that people being frustrated leads to an increased risk of either verbal or physical aggression, and you can start seeing other negative behavior like hostility or theft or sabotage, especially in the workplace. But it isn't that sort of causal relationship where you have to have been frustrated to be aggressive and being aggressive leads or comes only from being frustrated that this hypothesis originally proposed. So it must be more complicated than just one directly leads to the other. So what else is going on? So we can argue that people who are frustrated don't always lash out aggressively, and people who are aggressive don't necessarily become aggressive just because of frustration. So you can become aggressive due to multiple other stimuli. Maybe you were provoked. Maybe you're in a crowded environment. Maybe it's too hot. All of those things can lead to aggression, but they don't necessarily require you to have been frustrated first. But how do we learn to be aggressive? So we can talk about it in terms of either reinforcement or modeling, or a little bit of both. So, reinforcement is basically the idea that you will be more aggressive when the behavior produced a positive outcome for that particular individual. So, if you were aggressive and it got you the outcome that you wanted, then maybe in the future you're going to be more likely to be aggressive. So if you were being bullied and you stood up for yourself and you punched your bully and you were never bullied again, well, then maybe the next time you're in a situation where someone's bothering you, you're going to be more likely to just lash out aggressively because it worked in the past. That was a reinforcement of the behavior because you got the outcome you wanted. We also see modeling having an effect on whether or not children display aggressive behavior. So there's a positive correlation between aggressive children and parents who modeled aggressive behavior. In 104, I talk about the Bobo dolls, which are these weird, very creepy blow-up clowns. And there was a series of experiments where children were seated in a room where they could see a Bobo doll and an adult would come in and interact with the doll. Now, if the adults came in and punched the doll or kicked the doll or were sort of laughing or encouraging this kind of aggressive behavior in any way, children who saw that would be more likely to also be aggressive, to go in and punch and kick the doll. So children will model behavior, especially when it's encouraged. So there's lots of evidence for children exposed to aggression will then be aggressive themselves because that behavior was modeled. And as promised, we can move on into psychological factors that affect aggression. For the purposes of this lecture, we're going to focus on perceived intent, empathy, and emotional regulation. We're going to start off by talking about self-justification. So the person who is being aggressive may try and come up with reasons why their aggression is justified. They want to feel better about themselves and they don't want to feel like they're doing something wrong, so they will try and self-justify their behavior. And they can do this a bunch of different ways. So they could talk about it by blaming the victim. Maybe if someone's experiencing road rage and they're going to run someone off the road, they might justify it by saying, oh, well, they cut me off. They deserved what happened to them. So they've taken sort of a simple act of maybe someone made a mistake and cut you off. Or even if it was intentional, does that necessarily justify running someone off the road? Not really, but when people are being aggressive, they can try and justify things as best they can. So blaming the victim for what happened because they deserved it. The person being aggressive may also try and minimize the seriousness of their aggressive act. Oh, well, I ran him off the road, but he's fine. It's just, it wasn't that bad. They're fine. I just stood up for myself. Or maybe they're going to dehumanize the victim. A lot of times when this happens, you start stripping the victim of all of their human qualities, maybe treat them like an animal. So you start thinking of them as undeserving of fair and equal treatment. And again, they deserved what they got. You just responded to protect your own or stand up for yourself or whatever. They don't matter because they're just a slug or they're just a rat or something along those lines. So by dehumanizing them, you usually compare them to animals so that you don't have to care as much about what you did to them. We can also start looking at attribution of intentionality. So we've already kind of talked about attribution of behaviors, what you think someone else's motivations was, but if you're looking at aggression and trying to decide how to respond to someone, you might attribute their behavior as having the intention of being hostile. So if somebody's yelling at you, maybe you're going to attribute that behavior, that act of yelling, as they have hostile intent. That person is going to hurt me. I should respond in kind. And this runs us into a very problematic cycle where angry and aggressive people tend to also perceive others as having hostile intent. So if you're someone who's usually aggressive and angry and lashing out all the time, you assume that other people are the same way. So if someone raises their voice at you, you're going to quickly assume that they mean to fight you, they have aggressive intentions, and you respond in kind. So that misattribution, maybe, of intentionality might start leading to more aggression because you're already assuming that there's going to be a fight, so you make it happen. And that can be a vicious cycle of more and more aggression. Our degree of empathy can also influence our behavior in response to aggression. So if somebody does something, maybe they're aggressive, but afterwards they apologize, we then have a choice. Do we forgive them or do we stay angry? And our ability to understand that person's viewpoint, our ability to empathize with them, can influence whether we accept their apology or whether we escalate. So if somebody stepped on your foot and you look at them and, it's just another student, someone just like you, they don't look scary or anything like that, and they've apologized, they seem sincere, maybe you're going to say, okay, I accept your apology, no big deal. But if somebody steps on your foot and they apologize, but maybe they don't look like the kind of person that you would trust. Maybe they look, I don't know, sketchy. So maybe you decide, well, I don't believe that you are sincerely apologizing. Maybe I'm angry about this. I think you did it on purpose. Start attributing intentionality. I think you did it on purpose. Maybe you're looking for a fight. So you might escalate that problem. And this responding is all going to relate to our own ability to regulate our emotions. Are we people who are easily angered, or are we more likely to be relaxed and chill? Can we keep a cool head and persevere with a civil discussion? So lots of factors go into whether we are aggressive or not. Now, it's very difficult to talk about aggression and human aggressiveness and to not talk about Sigmund Freud, because Freud, the proponent of the psychodynamic process, was obsessed with aggressive behaviors, among other strange human behaviors as well. But Freud had, among other things, this idea of catharsis, where humans had these aggressive urges and we would build up aggressive feelings and aggressive motives, and we would bottle it up and try not to act on it until all of a sudden we'd hit the point where we were too angry and we had to release that aggression somewhere. This is where catharsis comes into play. Aggressive behavior, lashing out, is a way to discharge that aggressive energy, that buildup of negative emotions. So if you do something like play a violent video game or go punch a punching bag, that's an act of catharsis where you can release that tension and sort of achieve more calm in your life. So that behavior is going to temporarily reduce that impulse to be aggressive. And we try, though sometimes are not successful, to channel our aggressive impulses into socially acceptable behaviors. Things like playing aggressive video games or punching a punching bag, as opposed to going out and starting a bar fight or having road rage or something like that. So you find these socially acceptable ways to experience catharsis, to let go of that aggressive buildup. Other researchers or other theorists had proposed extensions to this idea of Freud's. And one in particular, Edwin Megory, yeah, that sounds right, Megory, had described some people as having over-controlled hostility. Basically, individuals who couldn't find a way to vent their aggression in a socially acceptable manner, they might have over-controlled hostility. So they would have very little response to most aggression. They would hold on to it. They would control their hostility, and they wouldn't get to vent it in any particular fashion. But over time, because they haven't released that pent-up aggression, they start running into an accumulation of aggression, and they can suddenly erupt into violence over very small things because they have all of this pent-up anger from not dealing with their aggression in the first place. So from this theory, we might proposed that it's probably better to somehow vent our frustrations, to be able to let off some steam, play some violent video games, punch some punching bags, or watch aggressive sports to try and get rid of some of those ideas, some of that aggression that we're holding on to. But does it really help? So let's evaluate that catharsis theory, the idea of releasing off that aggression by either living vicariously through others, so watching violent games or sports or TV shows, or having controlled bursts of violence ourselves by punching bags or maybe playing sports. We can look at catharsis versus social learning. And this is basically going to tell us that catharsis theory says that people who are finding a way of releasing that aggression, people who are watching more violent media and dealing with their violence in a potentially positive way, should have less violent outbursts in their lives. But you can probably tell already just from a quick glance that that's not really the case. What we see is that exposure to violence is actually related to a tendency to behave aggressively. So instead of this being a cathartic release, a safe way of getting rid of aggression, it actually seems to lead to more aggression. And that's where social learning comes in. So in this graph here, we're seeing right off the bat a clear sex difference. So if we're looking at females versus males and seriousness of criminal acts by age 30, this is just a measure of how much violence they're expressing in their lives. We're seeing that so for low, medium, and high amounts of violent TV watched when they were younger, the more violent TV you watch, you're going to have more violent acts in your life. And for males, you see a far larger increase in violent acts than for females. So even the most aggressive females, those who watched high amounts of violent TV as children, they're still lower than even the lowest level of males. So we see very clear sex differences here. But also this clear step-like pattern where the more violent TV you watched when you were younger, the more violent acts you were prone to having when you were older. Now, this isn't necessarily causation, because if we think back to chapter 2 and different types of experiments, it's very unethical to force children to watch violent TV in the hopes that they would become violent. So this is most likely a correlational study. So there's the possibility for other factors to be involved here, just to point that out. But there is a relationship between exposure to violence on TV and the amount of violence that people display in their lives. So the idea here is that people are learning to model that behavior. So they see other people being aggressive and they want to be aggressive themselves. In a lot of cases, when you're watching TV shows, that aggression is rewarded. So even the good guys, in quotes, in a TV show, they might kill a bad guy, but they'll be praised and told that they did a good job. They protected others, so that behavior was justified. And there's also some evidence that they're being desensitized to the sight and sound of violence. So if you're exposed to tons of violence, maybe it doesn't seem anything out of the ordinary and you don't feel bad when it happens. And it can also make you not care so much about the victims because you've seen it all before. So there's lots of ways that being exposed to a lot of violent media may be related to violence later in life. But again, I'm stressing that this is more complicated than a direct causal relationship, which is how a lot of media talks about these things. You'll see lots of headlines that say that playing violent video games causes violent behavior, but we know now that there's more to it than that. And apparently I was getting ahead of myself again because I included a whole slide on this, where the idea that violent video games are causing aggression isn't necessarily the case. We do see weak positive relationships between playing violent video games and having aggressive behaviors, but it's a correlation, it's not a causation. And we do see stronger relationships for games that are way over the top violent. So violent fantasy action is one of the stronger genres that's associated with violent behavior. So there's something going on there. But our big take home here is that the catharsis hypothesis is not supported, because that hypothesis would be saying that people who play violent video games should be less violent because they're venting their aggression. But what we see is that they are slightly more violent, but we don't know specifically why.